Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I want to take a look at the history of how I've been making my bass lines. Over the little more than 3 years that I've been making content, I have continuously tried to evolve the way that I'm creating bass lines and the way that I align them and mix them with the kick as well. So I just want to go through a few key stages of bassline creation that I've been doing. Finally, at the end of the video, I have something really cool and new to show you that I've been recently experimenting with. So here we have the project. Here I have 7 kicks lined up and 8 bass lines. What we're going to do is we're going to match each kick with the bass line, and then this final one will be the surprise that I talked about before. So let's just have a listen to the first kick and bass. Now this is from before I even started doing YouTube. So this is from 2019, late 2019, and it sounds like this. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to preserve the patch that I used for this. As you can see, we have 3 different parts here. We have a low bass, a top bass and a click, but these are all audio files. So I no longer have the actual patch that I used to create this one. The reason why I still wanted to include it in the video, even though I no longer can show you how I actually made it, is because we can already see a few things that I was doing really early on that I'm still doing to this day. Mainly removing the sub bass from the very first note, which clashes with the kick. So here we have the kick tail. And then we have the bass line. This part of the bass line does not actually have a sub bass, so I don't have to mix it in with the sub bass of the kick. Secondly, you can see fades everywhere, meaning that I'm leaving enough space for my transients to actually pop through and be extra clicky. If you don't have that, there is this loud part here at the end, which you can see. And just by removing that, it kind of prepares the speaker to play the next transient, to play the next click. Now, as you can see from the other groups, I used to separate my bass lines into 2 or more parts. I no longer do this because it just causes problem with the phasing. And there's no real benefit that you gain from laying out a bass line like this, other than a little bit of customizability, which you can also get in an individual patch with some clever EQing and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to the kick, unfortunately, I do not have the original sample that was used here. What you can see is that I layered it with a top hat, and with the top hat it sounds like this. So that just adds a little bit of noise on top of the transient. Now, my philosophy with kicks has always really been the same, in the sense that I don't find it very useful to spend a lot of time on the kick. So what I'll usually do is I'll use a sample which I'll slightly customize and maybe apply a little bit of EQ, maybe clean it up a little bit. Or just like in this case, add a layer on top so that it can help bring it out a little bit more, make it stand out a little bit more in the mix. So something like a hi-hat or another kick transient will allow you to do that. Now, as you can see from kick 2, 3 and 4, this is going to be a little bit of a trend, in the sense that I'm always going to be using some kind of sample from some kind of sample pack, and I'm just going to be layering on top of it and doing very small changes with EQs and stuff like that. And even for the later kicks, what you will see is that I don't like to spend a lot of time on my kicks. Over the last year though, I have been starting to making my own kicks, and the way that I'm doing that is I make my kicks in a separate project, turn them into a sample pack, and then when I'm actually producing, I'll just drag in the sample and make it work. The reason for that is my music writing philosophy has always revolved around pretty early on getting to the idea of the track. And I don't really consider the kick and bass kind of like an idea of the track, because every track has a kick and bass within Psytrance. So I want to quickly get to the unique selling point of my track, whether that be some kind of cool synth, maybe a bass pattern that I'm doing. Usually with a bass line you can be a little bit more creative than with a kick. There aren't a lot of special things that you can do with a kick that makes your kick unique to your track, as opposed to what other people are doing. A kick usually is just a kick, it's just that. So that means that for the rest of the video I'm going to continue focusing on the bass line, because I think that that will actually be more interesting. So that means that we're moving on to kick and bass number 2, which sounds like this. And this one comes from one of the first videos that I did, at least the idea comes from that. I don't know if this is the exact bass line that I showcased in that video, but the whole idea was using multiband compression to bring out certain parts of the bass line, mainly the transient. And I'm going to be honest, for this one, I don't think that that technique aged very well, because it was really not that useful in terms of you can get much better results by just synthesizing your bassline differently. But you can see right here, I'm actually not resampling this time, so I still have the original patch. We can run through it. You can see very early on that I started using the LFOs as opposed to envelopes. I've never really liked dealing with envelopes and calculating timings while there is a fixed timing envelope right in here that you can just use. The main differences is the shapes that I'm using mainly for the volume. As you can see, I'm going a lot lower with the volume. Nowadays I would go roughly like this for volume, but here I decided to go with something that looked a little bit more like this. And then for the shape for the filter, again, I would usually go nowadays with something that looked a little bit more like this to keep it a little bit more open. And then finally also no resonance on there. But for this patch I did decide to go with a shape that looked a little bit more like this. And I think what that meant was that the transient came out a lot more. Now this is an effect that I really liked, and that for the time I wanted to emphasize a little bit more. So I came up with this technique here, which is where you have this extra click rack. Now the whole idea of this rack is that there's two channels. So for one channel we're processing the sub bass and the high click. And with processing I mean a little bit of compression on here. Actually there's quite a strong compressor on there. But when you play it, it doesn't actually seem to be doing anything on here. What is doing something is this processing shape up here. Now in the previous video I did explain this graph here, the volume reassignment graph. And if you saw that video, you'll realize what this is doing. It is any loud volume will be made a lot louder by this graph, because obviously this line is moving upwards. So for example, any volume at -18, if there's a signal that's peaking at -18 for this band, it will be placed all the way up here at 0 dB or even higher. Now that doesn't really happen. Within the signal we keep values that are fairly low and that sit around this part here. So that means that they are getting quite a bit of a boost, but they're not going into the extreme values that exist higher up with the graph. Now for this part here, we're really taking out all of the mid-range. So this is processing the mid-range. This one isn't doing anything again, but this higher one is doing a similar effect, just a little bit less intense with a higher threshold and lower ratio. But it's still processing the bassline in the same manner. And in order to control that, there's an LFO tool here, which is just shaping this mid-range band here. So this is on those two middle bands. And then finally, we're going into a plugin that I haven't used in a very long time. This is BX Subfilter, which is a filter that allows you to enhance the sub bass through some resonance. As you might have guessed from this point, I wasn't really that familiar with how phase worked and how the kind of standard way of processing a bassline really worked. I was just experimenting and doing things. And to be honest, the bassline that I pulled out here doesn't really sound all that nice to me. You can hear that the transient just sounds off and the sub bass sounds weird, and the whole thing kind of sounds floppy in a way. Like it's not the tight click and mid-range peak that you would like from a bassline. So it's really sub heavy, and it's just really has that almost like a nasty click in the mid-range. Now what I quickly want to demonstrate is the cleanliness of my bassline in this stage. So you can see this is the waveform of it, and you can see that there's a few problems, but it's not actually that bad. One of the main problems is this transient just being too loud. Now this is coming from the way that we're doing the processing, like I talked about before with the multiband and all of that transient boosting stuff, in combination with how the envelope looked in the initial patch. But you can see that the post ringing into this bassline as well as into the kick is existent, but it's not really that big. But the main problem that you can see is that there's post ringing everywhere. There's post ringing from the kick going into the bass. There's post ringing from the bass going into the kick. I can show that better if I do this. You can see the post ringing from the kick right here and from the bassline right here, which means that both the kick and the bassline suffer from overlapping in these two spaces, which you can see if I switch between the layers and the summing mode. Now this is again coming from the fact that I just didn't really know what I was doing at this time. And you will see that for the next few basslines coming up. But one of the issues that you won't see coming up is the fact that what I used to do is I used to work with a production master. In essence, how I used to write music was I would come up with a small idea, I would start working on a project, and when I had a few loops and a few interesting ideas in there, I would immediately throw on a mastering chain. At the time, my reasoning for this was I wanted to get very close to the finished product very early on into the production. Which is really interesting because, for one, it helped me quickly identify what the track needed and what the track missed. But it also works against me in that I was already committed to a certain sound for the track from the very beginning. Also, what I didn't take into the account was all of the phasing issues that my master chain would introduce. I would regularly use multiband plugins in my mastering chain, and I wouldn't check out what they were actually doing to the phase of my kick and bass. Which means that the issues that we saw before in here would be exaggerated even more in the final production. But what we'll hopefully slowly see is that towards the end of this video, when I'm talking about the newer bass lines that I've been making recently, that I've been starting to take care of that more and more and more. So now let's head into kick and bass number 3. This one sounds like this. You can hear that this is a much tamer bassline sound. I believe this bassline comes from the first tutorial that I specifically did on how I make my Psytrance kick and bass. This wasn't some kind of gimmicky technique like the last one where I just wanted to explore some part of the processing. This was a video where I showed fully how I made this kick and bass. Now you can see that this is much simpler. I believe that in the tutorial I actually make the kick and bass from scratch, but I don't quite remember because it has been 3 years ago. So what you'll find is that with the constraints of, having to produce a video and having to have that video finished in some amount of time, I might have not delved into the creation process too much. What you'll see is a very simple patch here where we have first of all a very strange amplitude modulation setup, and then also again this kind of early on very closed kind of bassline sound, which is combined with a 12 dB filter, which is a very open filter. If we listen to this bassline as it's playing and I change the filter, you will hear the effect that the filter has on the bassline. Now this kind of setup, I haven't been doing that anymore. What I will do nowadays is I will use a 24, and I show the shape before. I will use a shape that sounds something like this. Which to me, because it's a little bit of a closer filter with a little bit more open modulation, just gives it a nicer gritty mid-range, as opposed to this almost rumbling kind of mid-range that you'll hear in this setup. Now obviously you cannot really compare two filters with two modulations just like that, because both of them need to be applied in a different way, maybe different modulations, maybe different kinds of processing. But really at this stage I didn't really care, and again probably because I made it as a video part, I didn't really do a lot of processing. We just have this one dynamics which is just a preset. I don't even think that I made any big modifications to this preset, I just kind of went with it. Then there's a single EQ and an LFO tool here just to cut out parts of the bass that I didn't want, mainly the post-stringing here. So this is a very simple bass line. Now one thing that is interesting and that I don't hear a lot of people talk about is very early on in my diving into Psytrance, I came from a background of making dubstep. And one of the things that I learned in dubstep was if you're synthesizing something, these effects are very important because you can make them part of the synthesis. For example, you can have a modulation on the distortion or the compressor or the filter in here that follows what you're doing in the synthesis. Now that's really not necessary for Psytrance basslines, and I see a lot of people who still use some of these. And to me, nowadays, listening to the effects from Serum, they are definitely budget effects, if I say so myself. They don't really sound nice to me. They do kind of the work of the synthesis part, but they always need extra polishing, or they always need extra stuff after it to actually make those effects work. Even something like the delay and the reverb that you normally wouldn't really use on bass lines, but take for example a lead sound. I don't really like how the delay and the reverb sound out of the box from Serum. I much prefer a dedicated delay plugin and a dedicated reverb plugin. Now the final thing to take away from this bassline is, again, I'm using sub separation. So the first bass note again does not have a sub. The way that you actually achieve that is you go into your patch. This is the same patch as before. And what you'll do is you'll just remove the sub right here. You can edit this curve. This is how it originally looks. You can see the saw wave appearing. And then if you move it down below, you get this saw wave that looks like this, which is basically a saw wave without the first harmonic. Also something interesting that I just noticed, I'm actually using this noise kick attack here to enhance the transient. And also I am already using no randomness on the phase to make sure that the phase always retriggers right here from this part. And when it comes to bass lines, for me personally, I always liked having the click at the very start. There's a bit of debate about it, if that's a good way to do it, or if you want to start at the zero crossing. To me, especially now with the processing that we now tend to do on it, it does sound really nice to have this phased out transient and to start playing the note right as this click is appearing, so that you get the first click from it going from 0 to a high volume if you have no attack, and then it quickly clicking down again. If you phase those two out, I think you get some very, very nice tones out of your transient. Now we come to a very, very particular era of me making bass lines. And the reason why I say that is this is the time that I discovered that I was having issues with my transients because of the post ringing and because of all of the processing that I was doing on my kick and bass. And I kind of almost became paranoid of doing phase shifts because I realized that all of these issues that I was having with all of the transients and all of the limiter distortion that you might get from that because of the transients summing with a sine wave that is coming from some post ringing, I decided to fix this problem with linear phase. And that's not a good idea because there's better solutions. The reason why I say better solutions is because some of that phasing you actually want in your bassline to get the iconic processed bassline sounds that we're all familiar with. But this is right around the time that, I was just getting into it. I've been really serious about Psytrance at this point for, I would say, 6 to 7 months. I don't exactly know where I took this bassline from. It might have been from my track Galactic Journey, but as I said, I'm not quite sure. But that does give you a time frame of what time around that would be. This is just a couple of months still into me having this YouTube channel. Now, when it comes to the synthesis, this bassline is a little bit different. As you can see, I'm actually using 2 oscillators, with one oscillator providing this kind of detuned layer. They both go through the same filter. I also use a little bit of a strange saw wave, and again I'm using a noise click as an attack. We have our standard modulation for the level of both oscillators, and then this is what is happening to the filter cutoff. Now what you'll see here is that this point is a little bit lower and this modulation is a little bit higher. Those kind of compensate for the actual difference. If I were to place this up right around here, I would need to take the modulation and just move it a little bit lower, something like this, which is how I normally do it right now. In here you can see I am actually using this compressor. I don't really remember if it does anything. I guess we can see if there's any gain reduction here. It does seem to be shaving kind of the top of the bassline, but as I said, nowadays I just don't use these effects anymore. So with the on-beat part, it's the same thing. I just remove all of the sub basses. You can see right here. And I'm actually sliding down this part as well. I no longer do this. What I used to think was that the tonality of the bassline would be altered too much if I just take away one harmonic and not address the harmonics around that. I don't know why I thought that that would be the case, because that really doesn't make any sense. You only want to remove the sub bass because you want to make it easier to mix in with the kick. Basically have the kick sub bass replace the sub bass in here. So it doesn't really make sense to then also start modifying other harmonics in here. It does change the tonality of the bassline a little bit, having that. But I really don't think that you should be doing it anymore, like than just removing the sub bass for your mixing and then just keeping the rest of the saw wave the same. So then in here we have a stereo layer, and this is just the bassline recreated for some extra stereo. I don't even know if I'm doing anything different here. I am adding a hyper effect in here, which is set to retrigger. But what I'm doing then is I'm going in with the stereo spread, which is generating our stereo image. And then finally I need to equalize it so that it only takes up the higher frequencies here. And even I would say that a filter like this is a little bit too low, because it still includes like the second and third harmonic. Nowadays, if I were to add a stereo layer, I would have this high pass filter a little bit higher so that I'm really making room for my mono component of my bassline in the lower frequencies, even the second, third, fourth, fifth harmonic and so on. But what you can see from this EQ is that it's set to linear phase mode. And as I said before, I was really scared of phase shift around this time. I really didn't know how to handle them properly. And that really became an issue because it made my bassline sound unprocessed. Even though I am applying multi-band effects to the whole of the bassline, to the sum of all of the bassline components, you will see that it does sound underprocessed because I'm not actually using it for any phasing. So this is set to linear phase, which means that there's no actual phase shift being created for this part of the bassline, not by this filter, not by any of the EQ boosts here, but it's just shaping the tone of our stereo layer. Finally, we have a click, which is again part of the same patch with some minor changes, mainly the fact that I'm just isolating the very start of the bassline here. So this again, combined with the fact that we're starting playback right from before this click, means that this click is kind of coming through this very sharp point here, and that's just it. Then it just stops, which means that we can EQ this click however we want. I wanted to add a lot of high end, so that's what I did here. And then to make space for all of that high end on all 3 of the other channels here combined, I have a low pass filter right under 10K. So again, I'm splitting up the functionality over multiple layers for my bassline, and that's not something that I would normally do anymore. I wouldn't have a separate click layer anymore because there's not much that you can gain from that. And as I said before, it's really hard mixing those 2 back together because they are phase offsets between the 2 layers. And that can really cause a lot of problems once you get into the processing and all of that stuff. Now let's quickly look at the processing. I start off with an LFO tool, which is a fairly odd choice word not for the fact that I'm using linear phase. So what I'm essentially doing is I'm putting the LFO tool at the beginning to make sure that it's synchronized with the project itself. If I were to place this after it, because of Ableton's plugin delay compensation, it would actually become out of sync with the project, because all of these other plugins introduce latency. And in Ableton, for those that don't know, latency is only compensated per chain and not per plugin. In other DAWs, latency is compensated per plugin, but that does not happen. So if this, which is a time-dependent effect, is later on in the chain, what will happen is that this chain will start to become out of sync with this shape, and then afterwards it is compensated, which means that your sidechaining is all over the place. If I play it like this, you can see that the shape really doesn't make any sense, but if it plays it right here, it does line up with the bass notes. That is that desynchronization effect that I talked about. So as I said, all of the processing is linear phase. Again, I'm using this Master Dance preset. That was a preset that I used to use quite a lot back in the days. Nowadays, I just make my own compression if I need compression on my bassline, which I rarely do, especially multi-band compression like this. But you can see this is just all coming straight from the preset. The only change that I made is that I set this to linear phase, as I talked about before, because I was scared of the phasing issues that this analog mode or the natural phase provides. Then I decided to push this into a limiter. You can quickly look at the settings here. We just have lower input gain and a lower threshold. I don't even know if this limiter is really doing anything. Very, very slight gain reduction here, as you can see. So this is doing minimal work actually. Finally, we have this stereo processor, which is just there to control the stereo field of my bassline, because we have a stereo layer in there as well. And actually looking at the settings now, I can see that I'm mainly using it for its exciter, which is just kind of a saturation. You can see that I'm not actually touching the widening a lot, but I'm also inputting it back into here to make it louder. So I essentially limit it before, where I have the gain go down, and then I push it up again, which is really, really strange because it's really the opposite way of pushing something into a limiter. So I guess it is not pushing something into the limiter in this case, but then I could just set a different threshold. So I don't really know what the thought process here was of this whole idea, what I'm actually doing here. And the reason why I say it like that and why I want to bring it over that I don't really know what I'm doing with all of these bass lines is because right at this point there's going to be a very long pause in my kind of finalizing tracks, and in that time I'm learning a lot about the Psytrance Bassline that I then apply to bringing out the new album that I just released at the end of last year. So for this point in my career, this is really around the time that I took that long break from the internet, and when I came back I learned a lot about music and I immediately learned a lot about phase in particular. And so my whole idea about creating bass lines kind of changes almost immediately. And I say almost immediately because right before that change happens, or a few weeks before that change happens, I actually worked on a very, very big video, which many of you may have seen, which is my ultimate guide to the Psytrance Bassline. And the reason why I remember that is because when I made that guide, I still didn't really know about the phase and how phase actually worked and how you can use phase to your benefit to create better sounding bass lines. And from that point on, from that video on, when I was starting to experiment and I got a few comments, mainly on that video from people actually asking about, isn't the phase positive? Shouldn't we use the phase? Even though I was in this very, very conservative, very no processing if you can avoid it kind of mindset. So I started to look up a little bit more about phase and I started to learn more, and what really convinced me of really changing my ways of processing was watching a masterclass by Eclip, where he specifically used a transient shaper in multiband mode without any processing that is actually being applied. Like, he isn't using it to shape the transient, he's just using it for the phasing and all of the processing that the filters are doing by just means of existing, right? Just splitting up the frequency signal into paths and then summing them together again changes the phase shift around the point of the filter cutoff that are used in the crossovers. So what that meant for me was a few things. One, I had to fundamentally think about doing basslines differently, which is one of the things that I did. The other thing was that I had this whole album that I was preparing that still used the old method. It also used the old method of still having a mastering on it while I'm still producing, which again, with all of the problems with my master, which used to use multiband processes that were not in linear phase mode, I decided to remix the whole album. And in that process, I again was confronted with this idea of having to do more phasing on my bassline. So this is one of the first experiments that I can find of me actually working on a bassline that uses phasing in a positive way. And the way that you'll see I'm using this is I'm having a very, very simple patch. Again, the whole premise of the patch is the same that we saw before. We have one LFO controlling the filter cutoff of a filter on a saw wave. And then we use the other one to shape the amplitude of that saw wave. Finally, on this one, I decided to go for a little bit of soft clipping on here. But the real magic really happens in the processing. So all of these filters are set up in a way that they're not really doing any processing. You can see that the ratio is 1:1, so there's no compression happening. But they are splitting up the signal into multiple paths and then resumming them together. To do that, they are using filters, which are at these crossovers here. And that means that those are going to introduce that phase shift that I've been talking about for so long now. And that means that they're going to introduce this phase shift, which is going to change the sound of the bassline. So I have one multiband plugin here. I then have an equalizer to really EQ out the sound how I wanted it to be. And then finally we have another saturator, which is again doing a little bit of saturation, although not on the lower frequencies. But what its main purpose is again using these filter cutoff, these crossover filters to introduce phasing into the signal and giving the bassline a little bit more of a processed sound. Now what I want to do is I want to just quickly listen to this bassline versus the last bassline. And hopefully you can hear that one really sounds more processed. I can show that by looking at the waveform. This is the old bassline, bassline number 4, and you can basically still see the saw wave existing here. You can see this upward click, which is coming from the saw wave, and then we have this kind of slope going down. Even though, because of the way that I was synthesizing it with this 2 oscillator setup, there's this extra little wobble in here. You can still in essence see the saw wave kind of existing here. This is a byproduct of linear phase, not actually changing the phase of the starting wave that you start out with. For this other bassline, you can clearly see that a lot more phasing is going on. You can see that we have in essence completely lost this saw wave and that the sub has been pushed back all the way to starting over here. You can see in this first oscillation there isn't actually a sub bass. And the sub bass really starts to come in here. You can see this kind of big sine wave movement happening starting from here. Now what you will see for this bassline is that it's already a lot cleaner. You can see that for most of these parts what I'm doing is I'm actually bringing this amplitude back to 0 dB right before the transient. And the way that I'm doing that is again through some resampling. So this is the bassline that was actually playing before, not the patch. And you can see that I have resampled the bassline, and in this case I've already consolidated it. But what I did is I record it and then I just add a fade like this, which means that it's going to 0 dB and then the next bass note will play. Now very early on in my experimentation with phase shifts and processing and actually applying filters to my saw waves, one of the things that I noticed is that it's a very inconsistent technique in the sense that there's several things that need to be set right. Mainly all of the cutoff filters crossover frequencies, all of them need to be set right in order for the phasing to actually be beneficial. You cannot just pop on a few multibands, set a few frequencies and call it a day. And what I would want was a system or a process that I could just kind of dial in with one knob or can throw on quickly, because my philosophy with bass lines, as I said, has always been to not really focus on it, not be the kind of producer that spends 2 hours on their kick and bass only to lose all of the inspiration for the track that they were working on. I always want to get into the theming elements and the actual enjoyable elements, synths, leads, vocals, pads, all of that kind of stuff, the musical part of the Psytrance track. And I didn't want to spend too much time on setting up all of these phases really precisely to get the exact bass line that I want to get. And for those who follow my channel, they probably know already what happened. I discovered a technique which involves a very special plugin called M Freeform Phase. Now M Freeform Phase is this plugin right here, and you can see how simple it is. From this one depth setting I can basically set the whole processing. And this bassline really comes from where I was in a transition point. I didn't really know how effective this technique was at first. I didn't really know how well I could do a full processing of a full bassline with this technique. But I would soon find out that it was actually powerful enough to do all of the processing for my bassline. So here quickly is the sound of that bassline number 6. Again, right now we're listening to the resampled form, so this is the track that you're actually hearing, this is the group that you're actually hearing. But if we look at the source, and what made this technique work is again a very simple patch. For some particular reason I decided to set up the modulation in a strange way in which I'm using the whole modulation but don't use the whole of the shape. I don't really know what the idea behind that was. Again, this is in an experimentation phase, so maybe I was doing some other experiment as well. We have a little bit more of a traditional volume shape here. Now, one of the very interesting things that I experimented with at this point is using a very long release on your bassline. And the reason for that is because this is set to envelope mode. This envelope is going to guarantee that at some point the level is just going to become 0 and stay that way. Where the problem begins is if you have very short bass rolls, your bass notes are going to maybe play up until here, and then they're going to kind of click off with a very short release. What I used to do is I actually would set a release to 0 and just pray for not having a bass note that would be shorter than the length of the envelope. But now if I did, what I would essentially do is I would have a release that is long enough to play the whole envelope, making sure that however long the note is that I play, it will always play a full note and thus get to this 0 point of volume. So that's the patch. Again, no processing in here because I don't really like this processing. We have the same version without a sub bass. So again, you can see that I've removed the sub bass in here. And for the rest, it's just the same patch. Now what I decided to do is, first of all, I decided to process everything on a group. That way I'm just saving some CPU cycles so that I don't have to have the processing duplicated for this track as well. And what you'll see is, one, I'm using linear phase EQ still. So I'm still using that. And that's just because I don't want this equalizer to interfere in any way with the processing that I'm going to be doing here in this M freeform phase. Because now we're starting to introduce this kind of big phase shift that you get from all of the processing, I don't want to have any unexpected side effects from any other filters messing with the way that I'm setting up my phase. So the chain goes linear phase equalizer into the freeform phase, then it goes into here. Now here I'm using a very strange technique, which is in essence just setting the volume of the individual cycle. And this is going to act almost like a compressor. Now you can see that this transient is all the way over here, so I kind of had to work with the fact that this LFO is behind a linear phase equalizer. As I said before, that introduces some weird delays, and you can see that this transient isn't actually on the grid where it should be. But the whole point of this is that this shape counteracts what is happening to the volume of it, which means that it kind of just squashes the whole volume together, making your bassline a little bit louder. Now this is a very rare technique that I barely use, but it is interesting to point out that I used it in this bass. So after that we go into here. Now this is a dynamics processor, and it's again using multiband, but these are again set to linear phase because I want all of the phasing to come from this process over here. I don't want to be in the situation where I carefully set up a phasing alignment with this process and then mess it up again by using random filters in here. So this is there just for the tonality or the processing of it. I don't want this to actually do any phase shifting. And the same is true for this M transient MB. Again, this is set to linear phase, to make sure that it doesn't change the phase of the bass line. Now, something that I'm remembering now that I probably should have said a little bit longer ago is that when I'm talking about the phase of the bass line, there's two things that you can talk about. You can talk about the whole phase, and I've talked about this on my channel many times before, but I still again want to give it as a reminder. You can talk about the whole phase, or where's the starting point of this entire waveform, or you can go into the individual harmonics and talk about the starting point of the individual harmonics. So these are the phases for the individual sine waves that together make up this waveform, which then has its own phase. What we're talking about with filters and all of the phasing that we do on a bass line, we 99% of the time talk about the phase differences between individual harmonics. So if I'm phasing this harmonic here, changing the phase, you can see it becoming out of shape with the rest of the waveform or back into shape again. This is what we mean when we say phasing. Filters affecting individual harmonics differently and changing the phase from one harmonic relative to the other harmonics. And this obviously happens around the filter cutoff in the sense that on one side of the filter cutoff there's going to be this kind of ramping down up until 180 degrees of phase shift or an entire flip. And then on the other side it's going to ramp down again up until 0 phase shift. So all of the harmonics that sit around the filter cutoff are going to be affected a lot more. And if they're exactly on the filter cutoff, they're going to be flipped 180 degrees. So for this one, I resample again and I just put it in here. And this is really where the last time I actually resampled a bass line came up. Because I became obsessed with trying to get a bass line that is A, clean, so that I don't need to do any cleanup. And B, still has that processed feeling. Now the reason for that is one of the annoyances that you have with resampling is that you're kind of committing to the bass sound. And with the way that I'm producing, I, as I said, don't really work on my bass line too much at the beginning. So for the majority of my production, even when I'm already thinking about, oh, I need to resample it because I need to finalize this production, I actually don't have the final bass line in there yet. I might still jump back and work on other things in the bassline, work on the processing in the bassline. Maybe I'll add still a stereo layer or something like that. So throughout my production, I'm not actually working with a finalized bassline. And this is a little bit of a problem because I do make mixing decisions or mainly arrangement decisions on what my bassline is sounding like. And even if I'm going to change my bassline, then obviously it's going to sound strange with the rest of the track, because the track was built around a different bassline. So what I really wanted was a bass patch that, one, would be clean, two, I could still hold in MIDI, and three, I have very few parameters that would allow me to quickly process a bassline so that it's at least very, very close to how I want it to sound. And this is really where bassline 7 comes into play. Now for those who have seen the video, the cleanest bassline ever, this is the same patch. I'm not going to go over the patch again. There's a 30-minute tutorial on this bassline out there. Also, if you want to download this particular patch, it's also on my Patreon, so Patreon supporters will get this. But the essence of this patch is that it does all of the work for me. So one of the things that I decided to do is, instead of using M freeform phase as an insert in this effect, I decided to render it into the waveform. So this wavetable actually uses the M freeform phase process to create. And there was a little bit of, I would almost say, kind of magic going on, making sure that this wavetable was created cleanly. I mainly had to remove certain frequencies at certain points because they were going out of phase too far. But I ended up with this wavetable that allowed me to basically have M freeform phase captured within a wavetable. So this phasing amount here that you see right here is going to be equivalent to what we see in bassline 6 with the depth here. These two knobs perform the same function, mainly adding more processing to the bassline or more phase shift to the bassline. Now there's some other magic happening as well. For example, it automatically switches between a version that has a sub bass and a version that does not have a sub bass. You can see here in the waveform, the sub bass has been removed. And in this case, because you're dealing with a wavetable with multiple cycles, instead of doing it in here, what you would need to do is go in here, process, and then remove fundamental. That will do it for all of the tables or for all of the frames in the wavetable. And then obviously this bassline is a lot more complex as well because of all of the different processes that I decided to implement, all of the macros that I wanted to have here. So there's a lot of macro modulations that you'll see and a lot of kind of switching. I have this oscillator switch between these two oscillators. This is my process oscillator, and I can also set it to just a normal saw wave. Again, this is a normal saw wave, just with the fundamental removed. And then finally, this patch also comes with an equalizer that key tracks to my bassline. You can see here we have a point at C2, but it's actually playing at A sharp 2, which is the last point that this bassline played at, the last note. And all of that is controlled from this inner rack here, where I'm actually splitting up the MIDI between Serum itself and this external instrument going into the equalizer for it to key track. So this is a very, very complex patch that does a lot of things automatically for me. And the nice thing about this patch is that it's very, very clean without any of the resampling. So this is still in MIDI, as you can see. This is MIDI notes. But if I play it and we look at kick and bass number 7 on Psyscope, you can see that we have a very, very clean bassline. You can see we go to 0 here, and then we have our transient, we have our processed looking bassline, which again goes to 0. We have no interference on the bassline itself. We have no interference with the transient of the kick. As you can see here, there's minimal post-stringing. There is a little bit of post-stringing right around here, if I'm not mistaken. You can see ever so slightly that here the line is below it and later it becomes above it, but that is so minimal that you won't even notice it. The reason why that's still there is from that one low bell that was sitting at around 100 Hz in the key tracking equalizer. So that is introducing a little bit of phase shift, but it's not enough to cause any of the problems that we were dealing before in terms of cleanliness. So the whole point of this part of the progression of my bassline, this part of the evolution of my bassline, was to make it easier to handle the bass in a MIDI format. It allowed me to quickly, without having to resample again, add new notes into the progression. What I would do before is I would resample my bassline, and every time I needed basslines in different notes, or I wanted to play a different melody, or I just wanted to change up the sound, I had to redo all of the resampling. First of all, I had to make the new changes that I wanted to have. Then I would need to do all of the resampling, and then I would need to rearrange my bassline, which obviously took away a long time and which was exactly what I was trying to avoid. Now, the one limiting factor of this patch is that the processing that you can do is very, very minimal. As I said, there is that one parameter in there which emulates the depth of the M freeform phase, but it doesn't really allow you to do any more processing apart from that and the equalizer. So what I really wanted was the same kind of patch, but with a massive amount of customizability. And this is really where we get into the next step of the evolution, or the last part of the evolution, hopefully. I hope that the patch that I'm going to be showing you today is going to, at least for me, make it so that I never have to really make another bassline patch again, only recreate different basslines with the same patch. So the patch that I'm talking about is made in M Sound Factory, and you can see it right here. This is the patch. Now, M Sound Factory is special in that you can create your own interface. So this is a device that I made purely for myself, and this whole patch is really, really powerful. You'll see that we have multiple different equalizers, compressors, we have a saturator, we have a whole stereo section here. And the cool thing is that I can rearrange all of these effects however I want. So this patch is set up so that you can rearrange everything. Now here I already have a bassline loaded, so I'll show you how it works. We have our globals here, which just detail a few things about the actual synthesize process. We have a grid, cutoff end, and click, which are all controlling the filter cutoff and the starting and ending point of certain modulations. I actually have two individual modulations, one for the body and one for the clickiness. And then this filter cutoff end kind of controls the brightness and darkness of the whole bassline. We have the phasing, which is equivalent to the phasing in the last patch. This actually uses the same synthesis technique of using that same wavetable where the M freeform phase is already imprinted in the wavetable. So the synthesis technique is actually the same. We also have our sub-bass control, which I can turn off and on in here. This is again making sure that the sub-bass only plays on the offbeat so that it doesn't collide with the kick. And then finally I have note lengths here, which just makes sure that the modulation is tied to the specific notes that I'm setting. But really the whole power of this patch is that what I can do is I can just save a whole bassline with all of its processing and all of the things that I would want to do with it into an individual patch. Now this took me roughly a day to make, this whole patch, and the reason for that is this is massively complicated. You can see we start with a generator where I'm doing a bunch of different things. This is our main bassline creation. You can see this is the same wavetable that we used before. Here we have a version with the sub-bass, here we have a version without the sub-bass. Those get mixed together. This is what controls when one of them is playing versus the other, when we have the sub, when we don't have the sub. That goes into the main filter. In this case, I'm using 36 dB per octave, which is even more close than the 24 that we saw in the beginning. And then that mixes together with the stereo layer, which is also in here. And then finally, I have some volume control, which is controlling the volume as the envelope. The reason why this envelope is so far behind is because I wanted to avoid any phasing of all of these filters that are in here, as well as these two filters that are in here. So the amplitude envelope is actually applied after all of this filtering. This means that any post-stringing introduced by all of these filters that sit in here isn't actually a problem. Now, in this effect really is where the magic happens. This is where I set up a whole bunch of different macros, and I'm going to show you through the macro list in a little bit. But you can see that we have this one order in here, which is actually holding all of our effects. This is the device that makes it so that we can reorder all of these effects. So I'm not actually putting individual effects in here. I'm holding them all within this one single module, and this module is taking care of the ordering of all of these effects. So this is how you build those devices. You essentially host all of your effects and stuff in here. Now, if you wanted to be easy to use, you would need to build an interface for this. And what you don't want to have is something like this where you just need to click through and then set individual parameters. You would like it to be a little bit more accessible than that. Maybe have it all from one screen. So that's where all of this comes in. Now, this whole interface is built by me, as I said before, and the way that you do that is by assigning multi-parameters. So if I open up the multi-parameters here, you can see a whole list of multi-parameters that I have assigned. This took a very long time. You can see we're using over 200 multi-parameters in this one patch alone. And what all of these parameters do is they essentially link one parameter. So for example, this one Q here, we can look it up. It's going to be this Q value here is going to be linked to this parameter here. You can see the same color. And then it's set up with a whole bunch of different parameters so that it appears neatly on the actual interface. The way that this interface building works is that any multi-parameter that is assigned a name and group will appear with the corresponding name in the corresponding group. Now, as I said, this took a day to make, so this is again very complex. But the whole point is I now have a patch that I can just create presets for and create bass lines for, and once I have maybe 30-40 bass sounds in here, I never really need to make a bass sound again. And for some producers, they might see this as very annoying. Oh, you're constantly using the same bass line. Are you really making Psytrance if you're not making your kick and your bass specifically for your track? But for me, this is kind of the pinnacle of creativity in the sense that I no longer have to worry about my kick and my bass line anymore. For my kicks, I have the samples that I'm currently creating, and for my bass line, I just have this one patch that I can go in. I have the right amount of controls. It isn't too complex like it is in this edit mode where we have all of the extra controls that you don't really want to use. It is just in here with individual sections of effects that you can apply to your bass line. There's a few interesting ones. This follower EQ is again a key tracked EQ. So this EQ follows the actual key of your bass line. So what that means is that there's some preset frequencies between an octave. So this first filter moves between the first harmonic and the second harmonic of your bass line. And you can set it at any key in between. There's 12 pitches in between, so this has 13 steps from one octave to the next. Same is true for this one, same is true for this one, and it goes up all the way up until here where there is a low pass filter. I can set it to low pass or low pass halved, which is a different form of low pass, so it's a little bit less steep. So you can see that this is basically a fully fledged equalizer, but this will follow the key of the bass line. So it's really meant to emphasize or de-emphasize certain harmonics in your bass. Whereas, for example, this parametric EQ, which I'm also using for this patch, is really useful for shaping the tone of your bass line without having that key track. Instead of thinking, oh, I want this individual harmonic to stand out or be pushed back a little bit more in the mix, I can say I want this frequency area to be standing out or pushed back a little bit more into the mix. I also have this quick EQ, which is just preset frequencies that I'd like to use. We have a low shelf, some bells, and a low pass filter. And again, the whole goal is to set it up in a way that this is instantly applicable to my bassline. I can instantly use it to just equalize my bassline really quickly. And the same is true for the compressors in here. These are compressors that I can also use. I have a final saturator that I can use, and then I have the stereo component here. The final thing to note is that there's also capabilities of creating this stereo layer. In this particular bass line, I'm actually using it. Now hopefully you will see that this creates the perfect environment for me to quickly create a bass line, but then also have the customability of all of these processes to later on dive into and get the exact shape that I wanted, without having to deviate very far from the initial bass patch or without having to resample it. So that's it. That's where I'm at right now with my bass line. What I want to show you next is one final key feature of what this new technique, this new bassline patch can do. So this is a great example of something that this new bassline patch can do. Here we are in a project that I'm starting at 110 BPM. It sounds like this. And this is using the new M Sound Factory patch, as you can see. Now what happens in this track is that I eventually want to get to a normal BPM for Psytrance, so away from 110, and I want to get it in this build-up right here. What in essence happens is, because it's still a MIDI, it will generate the same bass line just over a little bit less of time, because it's, going faster. There's less time between each of the kick hits because the BPM is higher. Right now we're at 143 BPM. So you cannot really achieve that with resampling or any other technique really, because it's so specific to the processing that you apply, the phasing that you apply, and the length of each note that it needs to be to cover up the actual space that the bassline needs to cover. But here, because it's still MIDI and we're in essence generating the whole processing within the synthesis part, within that wavetable, what happens is that it will just generate bassline for this length of time at 110 BPM, and then later, when the BPM is higher, it will do the same thing for 143 BPM, just over this amount of time, which is now shorter because the BPM is higher. It will generate a bass note that just fits in this part, and the same for here and the same for here. I don't have to resample anything, I don't have to control anything, I don't have to really worry about not setting the parameter to the right way. I can just purely do that on ear. And what also happens is I can potentially use this bassline in parts where the BPM is changing without it ever going out of sync or not spending enough time to cover up the whole part of the track that it needs to cover. The length of the bass note will always be a 16th note, independent of how fast the BPM is going. So this is really, really powerful, and I hope that I can inspire you to maybe spend a lot of time worrying about if the way that you're making a bassline right now is the most efficient way for your workflow. What I am going to do is do a deep dive into this patch, and then I'll also give this patch away to my patrons, this M Sound Factory patch. But the problem with that is this bassline is obviously made for progressive psytrance and it's made for my sound, so it might not work for you. So for that reason, I hope that this video can inspire you to show you that there's always progression possible, and you can always make it easier for yourself to make your bassline fit the workflow that you have. Maybe you also don't like spending 2 hours on a kick and bass only to find out that the track that you actually wanted to write sounded different in your mind and that the kick and the bass actually don't work for your track. That was one of the main reasons why, for me, it was so frustrating to work with the kind of traditional method of using filters, resampling, and then actually writing your track around the bassline. I don't like to work like that, so I made this new patch that allows me to work in a way that fits my workflow a little bit more. Now, hopefully you found this video interesting. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and if you're new here and you want to see more of my channel, then make sure that you're subscribed. But I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.
In a very deep and bitter sense.